Hi everyone, my name is Jethro and I'm a full-time photographer. I've been practicing my craft for the past 6 years and today I'll be teaching you how to edit photos on Adobe Lightroom. In this masterclass, I'll be editing all the photos you see here on the Lenovo Yoga Slim 7 Carbon. The Lenovo Yoga Slim 7 Carbon is truly designed for creatives like me who work on the go. Super light and durable, with a battery that pretty much lasts all day, I find that it is now no sweat to bring it out with me, even on the days when I'm bogged down with all my gear. An 8-core AMD Ryzen processor and Radeon graphics card ensures speedy performance while delivering crisp, vibrant graphics, displayed on a color-calibrated true black screen, meaning that not only can the laptop handle complex creative tasks, it also ensures color accuracy, which is a key aspect in my line of work. Equipped with the new Lenovo AI chip for smart machine learning and with a user-friendly Windows 11 interface, I can customize my workflow even more efficiently. The Yoga Slim 7 Carbon truly combines the best of both worlds, portability and performance, allowing me to work anywhere and everywhere. In part 1 of this masterclass, I'll be covering an introduction to photo editing. I'll show you what are the elements that make up a good image, and then next, I'll run through the commonly used tabs on Lightroom. And lastly, to round off the class, I'll be showing you a basic editing workflow that you can use on Adobe Lightroom. So, what makes a good image? There are actually a few elements that you can consider when it comes to this, and they are lighting, composition, the subject, patterns, and color. Taking advantage of these will help you to craft a better story for your image. First up is lighting. Lighting is one of the more important elements when it comes to showing a good image. Lighting can really make or break your photo. And let me go through some examples with you for this. Okay, in this picture here, I made use of the morning light to create an ethereal hazy glow around my model, evoking an Alice of Wonderland sort of feel. Okay, and in this other image over here, I decided to catch the sun shining through the forest, refracted by the mist, which makes for a more dramatic photo. Without the presence of light in either of these photos, actually, both of them will feel rather flat, less dynamic, and the scene will feel very normal per se, as opposed to having some shafts or dramatic light in it. Onwards to composition. You should take notes of elements such as rules of thirds, framing your subject with another element, or even leading lines, so that you can really tell a story through your image and to also allow your subject to stand out as well. Now let's take a look at another example I have over here. As you can see, I have framed my subject, the monk here, through a doorway. As the viewer sees him walking away with his back to the camera, I hope to evoke questions like, who is he? Where is he going? And even, what is beyond the doorway? The next element is your subject. Your subject actually matters. After all, they are the star of the show. They are the main character of the story that you want to tell. In that sense, when seeking out subjects, especially in street photography, finding people who stand out from the crowd or from their surroundings is actually a great tip in trying to tell a story in just one frame. For example, in this photo, I had taken a shot of this woman furiously using her phone by the riverside. I thought that her lone figure against the ships in the distance, as well as the city further back, made for an interesting shot. As when I was there photographing her, I myself was wondering what was going through her mind, considering that she was just typing away for ages, rather than looking at the scenery or anything else. Next up, we'll be looking at patterns. Patterns are repetition of shapes, objects, and color. Using these are actually the key to being able to draw your viewer into your image. When I was walking past this building and I saw the repeating hexagonal shapes on its facade, I thought that it made for something different than the usual skyscrapers that you see around town. On top of that, I had decided to frame it such that the viewer's eyes would be drawn upwards towards the top right, where the hexagons seemed to shrink as they seemingly went on into infinity. The last element I wanted to talk about is color. Color, or the absence of color, can actually help your subject stand out. If you look at this delivery man over here, he stands out despite all the clutter and all the crowd around him, simply because he's the only one in orange and yellow. This draws the viewer's eye to him and would greatly aid in keeping them riveted on subject, for he'll be the main character in the story of this image. By taking note of these 5 elements, half the battle is already won. And next will be post-processing. What you do in post-processing will complete your image and will complete the story in the way you want to tell. Beyond the 5 elements I mentioned, there's actually 2 more ways that you can improve the composition and the story of your image. First, there is cropping, and secondly is photo angles. Cropping actually allows you to emphasize your subject by removing unnecessary details and distractions. In this photo, my subject here is this red taxi. However, you can see that in the distance, there's actually all these cars and traffic, and it's quite a distraction. If I crop down the image like so, you can see that now your attention is on the taxi, with the pattern tarmac filling up the rest of the frame, giving the image a much more polished feel. Now let's talk about angles of your photos, or in other words, how your subject is angled. By actually playing around with the angle, you can help to fill up the frame, providing more focus on your subject. There's a lot of different applications to photo angles, so let's take a look at just one example over here. In this photo here of me, you can see that while the photo is aligned and straight and flush to the edges, my posture looks rather unnatural as I was leaning over a bit too much. It's quite awkward and the empty space on top doesn't help. Now, if I actually angled the image like so, it no longer looks like I'm leaning backwards at all. And with the slight crop in, there's an overall cleaner look. It's much more balanced. This is one way that you can play around with photo angles. Now that you know the elements that make up a good photo, we'll move into post-processing proper. Here, I will cover the basics of photo editing on Adobe Lightroom. First, I'll start with explaining some of the more commonly used tabs, from the basic tab all the way down to the transform tool. So the crop and straighten tool is the fundamental first step of image processing. So you click on this, and then now you can drag the guidelines to crop your image. If you realize you can freely crop, but if you select the padlock icon, you can lock your image aspect ratios so that you can choose a certain aspect ratio that you want. In this case, I'll be choosing 4:5 because I would like to post this image on Instagram. So I'll just do the crop as I wish. I'll do follow the rules of thirds. So it's a 2/3 sky, 1/3 water with the city in between. And then on top of this, you can also straighten your image. If you notice, the city skyline here is not parallel to the grid lines. So what you do is you select the straighten tool, this ruler here, and then you just click and drag a line across. And then once you let go, Lightroom will automatically straighten the image for you. So now that you are done with it, you can just click the done button, and there you have it. Your image is straightened. We'll move on to the basic tab. So the basic tab is meant for base corrections and is split into 3 different categories: white balance, tone, and presence. So white balance is these 2 sliders that you see here, which are temperature and tint. Tone is split into 2 different categories, which the first one being exposure and contrast, and the second being highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And lastly, presence is these 5 sliders here: texture, clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation. So I'll go through each of these sliders one by one. We'll start with the white balance first. So in white balance, we'll look at temperature. Temperature is how warm or cool your image appears, in that you adjust the temperature of your white balance. When you slide the temperature to the left, your image appears cooler, it appears bluer. And in contrast, if you slide it to the right, the image appears warmer, it appears a bit yellower. Now we'll look at tint. Tint actually works in tandem with temperature because as you slide your temperature around, it can give your image a somewhat red or green tint. For example, for this image, if I shift it to the right, you can see that there's a slight green tint that is added on in addition to the image becoming warmer. So the tint slider will be able to fix that, in that if I shift the tint slider just a bit to the right, it will add on a bit of a purple tint, which will cancel out the green tint that was added onto the image when I shifted the temperature to the right earlier. Now we'll look at exposure. Exposure is a global adjustment that affects all light, mid-tone, and dark areas of a photo. It's a very blunt instrument to adjust an image's brightness. So by shifting it to the right, the entire image becomes brighter, whereas if I shift it to the left, the image just becomes darker. So in this case, I will shift it to the right just so I can increase the brightness on the image overall so I can see the details. Now, moving on to contrast. Contrast affects just the bright and dark areas only. So it's a bit more targeted as opposed to contrast. So here a positive value results in a greater degree of variance between light and dark areas. So the image appears brighter, more vivid, and punchier. Whereas a negative value elicits the opposite result. So the image appears hazy, it's grayer, it's as if the mist in that you see in the photo has become heavier. So in this case, I'll shift the contrast a bit to the right just to bring out the details of the buildings that you see over here. As I mentioned earlier, tones are split into two parts. So now we'll look at the second part. First, highlights. Highlights only affect the light portions of an image. It's actually an instrument for fine tuning, and it's perfect for reducing exposure on blown out images, allowing you to review more detail on image. So as you can see, if I shift it to the left, the sky, the bright sky is actually now darker. You can see the detail in the clouds. However, if I shift it to the right, you can see that the light portions become even brighter, and they'll become, if I shift it all the way to the right, it becomes blown out. I lose a lot of detail. I can barely see the clouds here. So in this case, for this photo, I will definitely shift it to the left just so that I can review the details in the sky. Now, for shadows, shadows are the opposite of highlights, and they only affect the dark portions of the image. So it's also, again, for fine tuning, and it works in conjunction with highlights. So as you can see, if I lower the shadows down to negative portions, you can see that the area where the buildings cast a shadow, it becomes a lot darker. You can see that there's a bit more contrast and all that. However, if I bring my shadows all the way to the right, then there's no more shadows anymore. Actually, the image becomes a lot more flat, because when in conjunction with shadows and highlights, you can see that now the image has a lot of detail, while it has lost its dynamic nature, that there is no light per se, and there's no shadow. The entire picture looks the same across the board. Now, whites are similar to highlights, but they only affect the white portion of the image. You can see here, if I shift the whites to the left, now the white portions all become darker. Whereas if I shift the whites to the right, I increase the amount of white in the picture, everything becomes much brighter. So again, I'll shift this in conjunction with the highlights to the left to review more detail in the sky. Now, blacks are similar to the shadows, but they only affect the black portion of the image. So again, if I shift the blacks to the right, you can see that the image becomes hazier, that as there'll be less blacks in the picture. If I shift the blacks to the left, the image becomes more contrasty, it becomes much darker. So again, in this case, I'll shift the blacks to the right in conjunction with shadows. So in this case here, you can see that with highlights and whites in the negative range and shadows and blacks in the positive range, you get a very, very flat picture where there will be a lot of detail revealed, but the picture it feels very one-dimensional and quite dead. But this is quite essential when it comes to editing, as it's more important to be able to see the details in your subject, and you can always fix the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks much later. Now we'll move on to presence. First, we'll look at clarity. Clarity adjusts what is known as the edge contrast, whereby it affects the definition of lines and edges. So an increase in clarity will cause the image to pop, while a decrease in clarity will create a very soft and dreamy look. In this case, I'll increase the clarity here just so that you can see the details on all the buildings. Now, texture is similar to clarity, but it only targets high frequency areas. So areas that have lots of small details, while ignoring low frequency areas where things are broadly the same, such as the sky or water. So again, I'll increase the texture a bit so I can bring out more details in the buildings, as opposed to if it was not adjusted at all. Now, if you realize, you can still see that the picture looks very hazy and foggy. So this is where the dehaze slider comes into play. This dehaze slider helps to mitigate the issue of hazy and foggy elements due to the weather or lens imperfections. Now, if I shift it to the right, the haze sort of disappears, but the photo starts to appear very vibrant and saturated. So it's really very easy to overdo the dehaze function. Now, if I shift dehaze to the left, the photo becomes very faint and the haze and fog becomes very, very pronounced. Now, so in this case of this photo, I would shift it to the right just to remove some of the fog, but I'll make sure not to go overboard so that I can still keep some element of the fog in the photo, as well as to preserve the current level of saturation, because I don't want it to be too vibrant and overdone. Now, speaking of color, we'll look at the next tab, which is vibrance. Now, vibrance causes the duller colors of the image to appear more, while leaving skin tones mostly alone when you increase its value. So skin tones will be oranges, reds, and a bit of yellows. So as you can see here, if I'll just increase it a bit, you can see that everything but the small bits of oranges here are increased. Now, saturation is similar to vibrance, but this affects the value of all colors, thereby giving the photo a punch of color when you shift it to the right. So as you can see here now, everything is super vibrant. Conversely, you also can remove every bit of color from the photo if I shift it all the way to the left, so it becomes a completely grayscale image. In this case here again, I'll follow. Before I teach you how to shift tones around a tone curve, you need to know what tones are. So tones are split into 4 quadrants: shadows, darks, lights, and highlights, with midtones right in the center. So the tone curve adjusts tones to make things brighter or darker, and allows you to be even more accurate with your adjustments than with just the basic panel. So on the tone curve, there are different modes that you can use. I personally prefer to use the point mode over here because I feel it provides you with more freedom to edit. So on the point mode, you can set control points to anchor tone regions by just clicking on it. So here, for example, if I want to anchor the mid-tone, I simply click on it and have my point set. And you can shift control points around to adjust specific tones in the image. For example, if I want to shift my shadows, I can simply add a point here, then click and drag the point. So if I shift it down, the value of the shadows increases and the region becomes darker. If I shift it up, the value of the shadow decreases and the image becomes lighter. Now, you may ask, what is the difference between manipulating tones on the tone curve and using the basic slider? Say, for example, we're talking about shadows. Now, the tone curve allows you to affect specific parts of the shadows of a photo as opposed to using the shadow slider, which affects shadows as a whole. So this further allows you to fine-tune your adjustments. Additionally, you can also specify control points by clicking on the dot at the top left-hand corner over here and then clicking on the image. So let's say, for example, I would like to edit the dark clouds over here. So I can simply click on it, and then you can see that there's a corresponding point that will appear on the tone curve. By shifting that point around, I can easily control the tones in just that part of the photo. So this is really very useful when it comes to wanting to just change a specific area. It's much more direct than trying to play guess and check with the tone curve. Another mode that you can try when manipulating the tone curve is parametric, which is this one over here. I personally don't really like this mode, but I'll explain to you how you can use this as well. So the sliders on the region panel here can increase or decrease tonal output per quadrant along the highlighted areas only. In that sense, it's rather restrictive because it doesn't allow you to go beyond the highlighted areas. For example, this is the most that you can go for shadows, not anything more than the highlighted area. And additionally, another adjustment is the sliders on the bottom. The sliders on the bottom of the curve allow you to shift the area of adjustment around. So if you want the shadows to cover more of the picture, you simply shift it all the way to the right. Now, the parametric curve is still much more restrictive than the point curve, and in my opinion, it's much harder to use. But even then, because of the restrictions, it is a good guide for those who feel less comfortable with freely making their own adjustments and who feel that they require some form of guidance. There's no hard and fast rule to what a tone curve should look like, but in general and based on my own experience and after editing so many photos, I would go for an S-shaped curve. So you can already see here on the point curve mode that there is a semblance of an S curve. So an S-shaped curve provides an increased mid-tone contrast, making your photos appear more vivid and more dynamic with its lights and shadows. So for this image, I would lower the shadow point over here, and I will increase the highlight point over here. So this gives, that way, your shadows are darker while the highlights are brighter, which provides more contrast and detail in the photo. Additionally, what you can do is that you can shift the ends here away from the corners. So this will give your image a more matte look. Now that we are done with the base corrections and tonal adjustments, we have more or less completed the edits that will affect your image globally. And now we can move on to specific adjustments in the HSL tab. So HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. It's meant to fine-tune the color of a photo through the isolating adjustments to specific colors. Let's take a look at the hues first. Hues adjust the tonal range of a color with respect to a color wheel. So if you look at the first slider on red, if you shift red to the left, all red tones become magenta. If you shift it to the right, all red tones become orange. As for orange, you shift it to the left, they become red. If you shift it to the right, they become yellow, and so on and so forth, moving down all these sliders. So for example, if you shift the hue of green to the left, it introduces yellow tones, whereas if you move it to the right, it will introduce teal tones. So this is very useful when it comes to unique lighting conditions that result in the hues of certain colors not looking the way you want. So you use the hue tab to correct these colors. In this case here, I feel that the water is a bit too green. I would shift the green more to the aqua side of things. And as for aqua, I will move it towards blue to further blank out any green tones. But of course, changing hues is not just enough. You have to use them in conjunction with the other tabs. Saturation refers to the strength of the color, and unlike the general saturation slider that affects all colors, these sliders are actually specific to each color so that you can see there are sliders for red, orange, yellow, and so on. So each slider you move affects the intensity of its corresponding color. As such, this offers more fine-tuning should you ever find a particular color too overwhelming or too underwhelming. So for example, after all the adjustments I've done so far in this photo, you can see that blue is a little bit too much, and I will reduce them a bit. So as you can see here, if I reduce the blue, you can see that the steel gray color of the buildings come through. It's a lot nicer. Additionally, greens and aquas are a bit much as well, so I'll reduce their intensity. So the picture will appear a little bit more desaturated. Additionally, if you look at here, you can see that the tents and the boat are in orange. I would like to accentuate the colors of that. So I'll increase the reds and orange correspondingly so they stand out a little bit more. Additionally, the sky appears to have a bit of a purple tint, so I will reduce the saturation of the purples and magentas so the sky will go back to its grayish color. Luminous describes the brightness of a color, and this is used to selectively brighten or darken an image in areas specific to a color that you want to change. So for example, in this case, the buildings here all have blue. So we can increase the luminance of blue so that the buildings are a bit brighter. And you can see even the scenery behind is much brighter as well because they do have a bit of blue as well. Now, the oranges here on the tent appear a bit too dark for my taste. So again, I'm going to increase the luminance of orange so that it'll be brighter. At the same time, because the boat also has some tones of orange, you can see that it got brighter as well. Next, as for the greens and yellows of the sea, we can actually play around with the luminance as well. So if we increase the yellows, we create a bit of a bright patch here, so the sea is not too homogeneous. It is able to stand out a bit more. Same with the greens, you can increase the brightness. Conversely, you can also decrease the color here so that you have a very flat homogeneous sea. You have the trail here being more conspicuous than if you had a patch of light here. But it's up to personal preference, but personally for me, I would prefer it to not be so homogeneous, so I would increase the light just a little bit so you can see that there's some difference in the lighting from here versus the sea over here. Now that we have more or less fixed up the color of the image, we can move on to touch-ups. So first, let's head over to the Details tab over here. So the Details tab is meant for cleaning up images whereby things like sharpness, artifacts, and noise can be adjusted. So in the sharpening tab, you can see that there's a number of sliders here. Let's go through them one by one. Let's look at amount first. So amount is the degree of sharpening, in that the larger the number, the more sharpened the image will be. So if we zoom in here, and we look at this building, okay, you can look at it over here in this window as well. This is an even more zoom in piece of the image where you can look at the details more closely. So when the slider is shifted to the right, you can see that everything gets sharper and more defined. Of course, you shouldn't go to extremes, but we'll just demonstrate this for now. Next is the radius. This is the size of the sharpening area around edges. So the larger the radius, the thicker the sharpened edges will be. Now you can see that as I increase the radius, everything gets sharper and it gets more defined, especially along the edges of these buildings over here. Now, moving on to detail. Detail controls the amount of sharpening on the edges of an image. A small number would result in only the large edges here being sharpened, while a large number, that is, if you shift the slider all the way to the right, is that even the small little details here would also be sharpened. So as you can see, since I'll just push all of the sliders to the right, you can see that now there is a lot of edges that are now sharpened, and actually the image looks and feels a little bit too sharpened. Is a bit unnatural in that sense, and it actually can be a bit painful to look at. Now, so this is where masking comes in. Masking masks out the areas that should not be sharpened. So this is useful in removing additional noise generated when the amount and detail sliders are shifted to the right. So if I shift the masking slider to the right, you can see that the noise is removed and the image is smoothened. The photo now does not look overly defined. Of course, one should not slide the sliders all the way to the right because this is a really big extreme. In fact, for sharpening, adjustments can be quite minimal. So maybe you just need to shift the amount slider to about, say, 50. Usually I keep it to a range around 40 to 60. It really depends. For radius and details, I don't really touch them. I leave them as it is. And in this case, because since the buildings have a lot of large edges, there really is no need to. And for masking, again, as the changes in sharpening is rather minimal, I only move the amount slider. There's no real need to do masking. I mean, of course, this is also depending on your personal style. So say if you had actually increased the radius, the detail, and you had pumped the sharpening up a bit more, then yeah, maybe you do need to increase your masking just by a bit to counteract any of the noise that you see over here. Speaking of noise, what exactly is noise? Noise is when you shoot at high ISOs and under low light. What happens is that your photo becomes rather grainy, in that you have these little digital noise artifacts all over. So barring a stylistic choice, like say if you want to emulate a film camera, your image actually is of rather bad quality and is not as nice to look at when your picture is full of noise. So this is when the noise reduction tab comes into play. You are able to fix the amount of noise in your photo. So if you shift the luminance slider to the right, this will reduce digital noise. But however, this can remove the finer details of the photo as well. Okay, it is rather hard to show a noise in this photo because I had shot this at 100 to 200 ISO. So there isn't really much of an issue. There is no real need for noise reduction in this photo. So let's take a look at another example that I have over here. This photo here, that I have actually shot it at 6400 ISO. So if you zoom in, you can see that there is a lot of grains here. This is what's known as noise. Now, if we shift the luminance slider to the right, you can see that slowly all these grains are being removed. But at the same time, it's important to not go to extremes because now the face of my model here is actually losing quite a lot of detail. Everything is much smoother, but you don't want too much detail loss because then your picture looks overly smooth. It looks quite weird. For basic noise reduction, you don't really need to use these sliders here. It's not really important. So to counteract the loss in detail, for noise reduction, you can always use this in conjunction with the sharpening tool. So you just increase the amount, the radius, and the detail by a little bit so that every single detail from the large edges down to the smallest ones are all sharpened. And then to counteract the additional bit of noise, you can just increase the masking by a little bit. So by reducing the amount of noise and balancing it out with sharpening, now the image is actually quite ready for post-processing and even for prints. So this is how you save images that are shot at low light and very high ISO. Now let's move on to lens corrections. In this tab here, lens corrections fixes lens problems such as unwanted distortions, vignetting, and chromatic aberrations. So as a general rule of thumb, usually I will check both boxes here to remove chromatic aberration as well as to enable profile corrections. This is because most photos do have slight vignetting and distortion issues due to the lenses used, and some photos would have chromatic aberrations as well, which are slight bits of color distortion around objects, especially metallic objects where there is a high contrast between light and dark. So this process here is pretty automatic, and it's quite a good practice to check both boxes every time you do quick edits for every single image. Lastly, we'll need to adjust the photo's perspective, so this will be done under the transform tab. So you can level horizons, straighten images, and even fix proportions of your subject with this tool over here. Now, as you can see in this photo, the horizon is a little bit off, and the buildings are also tilted in a little bit. So there are multiple ways to adjust the perspective of the image here. They are both automatic and manual methods. So for the first method on auto, this automatically adjusts your photos the moment you click on it. It's quite okay to use when your perspectives are quite simple, but sometimes when you have complex perspective issues, auto is unable to detect that, so it's not very reliable. Next is level. So level automatically only adjusts the horizontal lines in a photo and ignores any vertical lines. As you can see here, the buildings are still slanted. Now for vertical does the opposite, and it only automatically adjusts vertical lines in a photo. As you can see, the buildings here, they're straight, but the horizon is not fixed at all. So the guided option allows for the creation of guidelines to tell Lightroom that those lines need to be straightened. So for this, I'll be tracing along the horizon like so here for my horizontal guideline. And then next, for the vertical guideline, I'll be tracing it along this building here. So once I've traced the line like so, and when I let go, Lightroom will automatically straighten these lines and by extension, the image. So this gives you more control over how you want to actually fix your photo, and it's actually more effective than the previous options, that are usually too aggressive or inaccurate. You can also manually play around the sliders to further fine-tune your image after any changes that were done automatically. So for example, if you think that the horizon is not straight enough, not flush enough, you can always tilt it just a little bit. You can even shift the horizontal perspective of the photo like so. If you want to do so, sometimes you need to. Or maybe just now for the guided part, this building is straight, but this particular one is a little bit off. So you can also just do like some final adjustments to try to equalize both buildings, and then you just rotate it just a little bit to fix everything more accurately. But honestly, right, the guided function can be your best friend, especially for architecture photos where you need the edges to be parallel and flush to the sides of the photo. After all, as the editor, you know which lines need straightening. So by drawing in your own guidelines, and after that by doing further manual correction, you're able to guide the program to adjust what needs to be fixed. There you have it. So with all our adjustments, this is the completed image. You can click this button over here to cycle between the before and after. So this is the before image, and this is after all your edits. So you can see here that the colors, the shadows, and the light, they stand out more, and the buildings are sharp and they stand out from the fog and mist in the background. And yet, I managed to retain the cloudy sky and a bit of the haze and fog in the photo. Additionally, the buildings, they are straight and they are flush against the sides. So overall, this is a huge improvement from what we have started out with. So with that, let's move on to a general workflow where we can put what we have learned into practice. Now we'll go through a basic editing workflow. We'll use this image here of a sunset as the example. Now first things first, you will crop down your image. So select the crop button. Make sure that the padlock is on so that you will lock in your aspect ratio. This time I'll select 4:5 because I would like to post this picture on Instagram. I feel that it's a bit too wide angled, so I will bring the crop in a little bit more so that the buildings will fill up the image more. At the same time, I will also ensure that I'm following the rules of thirds. So 2/3 of the sky, 1/3 water with the buildings in the center portion, so that it's more balanced, it's more pleasing to the eye. Now, so once you're happy with your crop, you click the done button and there you have it. We'll move to the basic tab now. So first thing, I would say that it's a bit dark, so I will increase the exposure. So this overall increases the brightness. Now I can see a bit more detail, but here it's really very dark, so it's a bit hard to check to see what I'm editing. So the first thing I'll do is reduce how dynamic the image is by lowering the highlights and the whites, and I will also increase the shadows and the blacks. So now the image is more flat per se, but you can see that there's a lot more detail. If you look at the before and the after, you can see that you can see the details on the buildings here. You can even see that there are trees. All this is actually just black shadows over here. Now we'll move on to the presence. So for presence, one thing I would like to fix is the how defined the building is and how soft the sky is. So first I will lower the clarity overall. So what this does is to make the sky a bit softer, and then to compensate for the lowered textures in the buildings, in the sharp edges, I will increase the textures just a little bit. So that way I achieve a softer look in the sky, but I still retain the textures and overall sharp lines and edges of the buildings. As for the dehaze tool, I don't see a need to really use it, because increasing the dehaze would just make the picture more vibrant and darker, whereas reducing it is just makes it looks hazier, which both ways doesn't really fit the look that I'm going for. Now we'll move on to the vibrance and saturation. So vibrance and saturation, right? There is one trick that you can use to really fix your sunsets. So remember when I mentioned that vibrance does not affect skin tones, that is orange tones. That means it will actually also not affect the golden sunlight that you see here. So to get a really strong golden color to the orange parts, what I'll do is that I'll increase the saturation by a bit. So what happens when I increase the saturation is that the entire picture becomes more colorful, more vivid. But remember, since vibrance does not affect your orange tones, I can just remove the rest of the color that I added in saturation by lowering the vibrance. However, you can see that the oranges are preserved. So that way, I have created a stronger sunset in this photo. Now, one thing I don't really like here is the greenish tint of the photo. So to fix this, we will go back to the white balance portion of the basic tab. I'll just increase the tint closer towards the purple side of things, and maybe also to really accentuate the sunset, I would increase the temperature just by a little bit. Yeah, maybe around 5,500. Yeah, so now that I'm quite happy with this, we'll move on to fine-tuning the tones of the photo with the tone curve. So the first thing you do is that you set up control points to anchor down the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights. I will bring up the two control points at the end, just so the shadows and the blacks and the whites per se will not be so sharp and so accentuated, but at the same time I will create a S-shaped curve here by bringing this point downwards and this point upwards. So that way I can still retain the vibrant dynamic look to the picture. This also allows the buildings to stand out against the sky. So once you have your S shape and you're quite happy with it, we'll move on to HSL, the color. So here you can see that after I've actually increased the saturation, I have played around the tone curve. The orange in this photo and the colors in general some of it are a bit too vivid, so this is what we'll fix. In HSL, I will look at the saturation first before moving on to hues and luminance. So in this case, I would say that the oranges are now a little bit too much over. So I will just bring this into a negative just to lower it down. But for the reds and yellows, I would increase this a little bit just to balance it out against the oranges. Next, greens, I don't think we need to touch them at all. We'll look at blue. So the blue is a bit too vibrant, a bit too dark as well. So I think it contrasts a little bit too much against the clouds and the orange glow of the sun. So I will lower the blue saturation and maybe the teal as well, so it doesn't compete and overshadow the sunset. And then also what I don't like here is the purple parts of the clouds. I think it's a bit distracting, so what I'll do is that I'll just lower the purples and magentas just a little bit to bring them closer to gray. However, do take note that you can't overdo this, because if you bring the purples all the way down to 0, then it becomes devoid of color, and it's very unnatural because physics doesn't work that way. So you should always take note to try to blend the colors together as much as you can so that it looks natural and believable. I mean for most pictures, that's the style that most of us would really go for. Now we'll look at the luminance. So for luminance, maybe what I can suggest here, I feel, is that I can increase the luminance of the orange so that the sunset, the glow is a bit brighter. I can do that for the yellows and the reds as well. And then I'll try to match up the dark areas, the purples here, by increasing them just a bit as well. And as for the blues, maybe I think it's a bit dark, so I will increase that just a bit. So now the picture just looks a bit more balanced, and your eyes are back again on the orange portions of the picture, as well as this little bit of overcast clouds. Another thing you can do with the hue here is that if you feel that it's not orange enough, you like your sunset to be a bit more dramatic, what you can do is you can lower the hues of the oranges and the reds so that you create a red colored sky. It's really up to personal preference what you wish to do. If you don't want such a red sunset, you can always undo the hue. You can even bring the red portion over towards orange and the orange towards yellow to create a sort of a earlier sunset per se. But for me personally, I would prefer a redder sunset, because it's also not every day that you get to see a very reddish hue in the sky, in Singapore at least. So we are done with the hues. I don't think there's a need to move anything else for that, because all the colors I would like to keep this natural, just dramatic skies and sunset, but natural colors for everything else. Okay, now we'll move on. Now that we are happy with all the colors and all that, we'll move on to the details. We will fix the sharpening of the images. So you can see here, this is a more close-up view of the pixels, so you can see how sharp it is. There isn't really a need to sharpen too much, because since everything is in focus, and after all, this is shot quite far away. So at most, I will just increase the sharpening maybe to 50 plus. I'll increase the masking just a bit to undo any noise that's created when I increase the sharpening. Noise reduction, there isn't a need to do so here, because this photo was taken, if I'm not wrong, at 100 or 200 ISO, so there's no real need to do so. Same with color noise reduction. Next, we'll go to lens corrections. So on the profile tab, it's important to just check these two boxes. First, chromatic aberrations. There isn't any in this picture, but it's just good practice to check this. So if there's any that your eyes missed out, this will automatically remove it. Next is to enable profile corrections. This will remove any vignetting on the side. This will also fix any slight distortions that's caused by your lenses. So after this, we will look at the transform tool to try to clean up the image just a bit more in terms of the photo angles. So for this image, I did not actually take it at eye level. I actually had taken it closer towards the ground and pointed the lens up so that I could catch all the sky. But what I don't like is that the buildings are a bit skewed and slanted, so we'll use the transform tool. I'll shift the vertical tab just towards the left so that the picture appears more straight, like so, maybe around -28. You can't do too much because if you shift it all the way, then your buildings will appear quite distorted and very lengthened, and also it just looks weird and unnatural. So I'll keep it around 29, -29, like so. And then also, if you notice, when you mouse over the sliders, you can see that there's a grid that forms. So you can actually take a look at the picture, just make sure that things are all aligned. So maybe I think I need to just shift this a little bit to make sure that it's the horizon is parallel to the top and bottom of the image. Yeah. So I personally feel that using this tool freehand rather than using the auto guided level of vertical tabs or the transform tool gives me more freedom to actually play around with how I would like my image to be angled. So now that you're done with this, just make sure to click constraint crop, just to make sure that in case just to make sure that there are no white edges at the side. Okay, so now that's done, we'll go back up to the top, and then we'll just do some final adjustments back to the basic layer to make sure that everything is in line with what we like. So maybe here I would feel that I can increase the highlights a bit more just to brighten the picture, brighten the glow of the sun. I would lower the shadows and blacks a little bit to bring back some darkness and shadow here, because after all, the less light is hitting the bottom. Again, I'll bring up the whites. I can increase the exposure just a bit. Yeah, so if you feel that it's too purplish after you had played around with all the HSL and all that, maybe you will just want to bring the tint down just a bit. But the thing about the tint is that between green and purple, too green, the picture appears dirty of sorts, whereas too purple, it becomes very unnatural and very closer towards a very deep purple and blue shade. So again, not what you want a sunset to represent. So, but it's also, again, it's always up to personal style. It's really how you define and balance your sense of style against how natural you want the image to be. So that's the end of part 1 of the masterclass. I hope that you have learned something when it comes to the basics of photo editing. And stay tuned for part 2 where I cover advanced editing on Lightroom. I'll see you then.